Hello and welcome to the LA Venture Podcast. We're David Waxman and Minnie Ingersoll, partners and investors at TenOneTen. I'm so ready.
So ready.
All right.
Excited.
Today we have Mike Palank from Mac Ventures. Mike has had a long career in the entertainment industry before becoming a partner at M Ventures in 2017. M joined forces with Cross Culture Ventures in 2019 to create Mac. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. Let's start off by you telling us a little bit about Mac and what you do, size checks, stuff like that.
Sure. So as you said, Mac represents a combination of two pre-existing venture practices, M Ventures and Cross Culture. We came together at the beginning of this year. It's an amazing partnership of just an incredible group of differentiated people in venture, and I'll get to that later. But the basics of Mac is that we are a $100 million early stage fund writing checks up to $1.5 million. We target 10% ownership in the deals that we go after. It's not a mandated thing, but that's our target. We've written checks as small as 450 and checks up to 1.5. You know, in terms of sector focus, we're technically sector agnostic, but we lean into the areas where we have outsized experience. What we like to say is we invest in what we know, and what we know better than anyone else. And as we'll get into later, I'm sure, the background in entertainment and politics and enterprise investing that me and my team have sort of dictates the areas where we invest a lot, and I can get into some specifics. And then geography, we are based here in Los Angeles, and we are also based up in the Bay Area. My partner, Adrian Fenty, is up in the Bay Area, and I have a partner, Allison DiNardo, who is in the city. So we see a lot of deal flow from Northern and Southern California. The majority of our companies are in California, but we have companies that are outside the United States and companies on the East Coast and in the Midwest. We're looking for amazing entrepreneurs everywhere.
Great. So you mentioned Adrian Fenty, who I know is one of your partners, but also, of course, I know him as the former mayor of D.C.
For sure.
Featured in Waiting for Superman, if I'm not mistaken.
Very much so.
Very much so. So you like to invest in what you know. Tell us more about who your partners are, what your backgrounds are.
Sure.
And what you know.
So prior to Mac, there was M Ventures and Cross Culture Ventures. And Cross Culture Ventures was Troy Carter and Marlon Nichols. Troy Carter is probably best known for being the music manager to Lady Gaga and Meghan Trainor and John Legend. But he was also a very senior executive at Spotify, and most recently has started his own full stack music company called Q&A. Marlon was coming out of Intel Capital, where he had spent 5 years. He was actually responsible for the launch of their diversity fund, which at the time was the biggest diversity fund in the world. And that has informed our strategy at Mac. But Marlon was coming out of Intel and looking to start his own fund and was looking for a partner. And actually, I think, was introduced to Troy to discuss him coming on as a potential LP. And I think when Troy heard the pitch, he decided, wait a second, we should do this together. And they formed Cross Culture in 2015. And like M, we're investing in early stage companies. They were about a $15 million fund. That fund has done extraordinarily well. They are a top decile performing fund. So kudos to the Cross Culture team. And Cross Culture was also Susie Rue, who joined Troy at Q&A, and Danny Brown, who's now working with us on the Mac side. So when they were coming up on the end of their first fund at the end of last year, Troy, wanted to do something entrepreneurial and knew that he wouldn't be a part of Cross Culture Fund 2. And so Marlon was looking for new partners. And that's when we started discussing Mac, and it became really clear very quickly that this was a really, really cool coming together of interesting and like-minded people.
So wait, just to summarize, so Troy and Susie went to start Q&A.
Correct.
So they weren't doing a second cross-culture fund.
Right.
And Marlon then joined you.
Or we joined him, or we joined together.
Right. You guys joined together.
And by the way, I think I'm the probably least well-known, least famous of my three other partners. They're all very illustrious people, and I'm totally happy with that.
Not after this podcast.
Not after this. Yeah, this is all going to change,
time.
fellas. Look out. So my partners at M are two amazing individuals. We'll start with Adrian, since we mentioned him. Adrian was the 5th mayor of Washington, D.C. That's his hometown. Prior to becoming mayor, he was 2-term city council. He was very motivated by education. I think he believes that changing someone's quality of education early on in life can really have a force multiplier effect on the quality of their life down the road. And as a politician, he worked really hard to improve the level of education for young people in that city. And I think as the movie shows, sometimes, he did things that were controversial. But like in the tech world, they like to say, move fast and break things. He was a move fast and break things kind of mayor, which I think, ultimately why, he found such a home in tech and startups and venture. But after he left office, he started advising a number of startups and eventually ended up meeting Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz through his work with various startups. And they, of course, were building out their services team, and they were building out a regulatory government vertical, and invited Adrian to join them as an advisor, kind of working on regulatory issues for their portfolio companies. So, he was working on with Lyft as Lyft was expanding into new cities and helping them navigate governments and making introductions to key decision makers in various cities. And he did that for 5 years. And, as an advisor there, he was able to sit in on literally every investment pitch meeting that the firm took. And so he said he sat in on hundreds of them and got to learn how Mark and Ben and Chris and Jeff and the whole team over there, how they evaluated opportunities, the questions they asked founders, and sort of just learned venture capital by osmosis from some of the smartest people in the world doing it. And after 5 years, he felt ready to go out and start a fund. And that's when he approached Charles King. And so Charles has an amazing career as an entertainment executive. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that he is the top African-American executive in the history of Hollywood. Certainly as a talent agent, I think he's one of the top executives, period, regardless of color. But he has made a name for himself as a maverick in this, 130-year-old business that historically has been dominated by white men. I was fortunate. I left a career as a hedge fund analyst in Chicago, where I was investing in, publicly traded small cap tech companies, to move to LA to start in the mailroom of the William Morris Agency in 2004. And Charles was my first boss. And I think he literally might have been the only Black person at the William Morris Agency in 2005. And he, at the time, was representing people like Tyler Perry, Andre Benjamin of Outkast, right after Hey Ya came out and was the biggest song in the world. He was representing amazing filmmakers, DMX, all kinds of actors. While I worked for him, he signed Tyler Perry. He subsequently represented Oprah and others. But he had this vision of certainly representing the top talent and helping them push their agendas in a white male-dominated industry that often didn't understand what they were trying to achieve. But his greater mission, and this carries into macro and Mac, is driving social impact by changing the way people are depicted on screen, changing hearts and minds. When you put people of color in those roles that are more aspirational or uplifting, as opposed to the crack dealer or the pimp or whatever, you can change the way people see themselves and the way other communities see each other. And it's very powerful. And he's had a very successful track record doing that, and a track record as an amazing deal maker as an agent. But he left all that in 2015 to start a company called Macro. And Macro is a diversified, multicultural focused media company that's focused on making premium film and television content. The company's probably most well known for making Fences with Denzel Washington a couple years ago, and Mudbound that got Netflix some of its first Oscar nominations. They've won numerous Oscars and Academy Awards and Golden Globe Awards. And so I was one of Charles's first hires in that business. We launched it in January 2015. And I was initially focused on digital. I mean, one of the through lines to my career, I think, is one, I've been very early in a lot of things that I've pushed forward. And two, I've always been an admirer of tech companies that have disrupted the entertainment industry. Not just companies, but digital creators, digital influencers. As an agent, I was signing digital talent before YouTube was even a big thing. So I've always been fascinated with that, as has Charles. And so when I joined Macro and Charles hired me, I was running sort of digital and strategy and helping think through, well, what should it, if you were to launch a new media company today, obviously you're going to do film and TV. It's still the bulk of the business, but what else is out there? And in 2015, it was the MCNs, the multi-channel networks, the Me Too's, the maker studios that were raising a lot of money and getting all the attention. And we thought about launching one of those and quickly realized as we looked under the hood that, wow, there's not a great business to the MCNs. And sure enough, they've all kind of gone away or been absorbed into bigger media companies.
Why is that?
There just wasn't, I mean, the multi-channel networks were basically like ad networks, but instead of like a publishing site, their channels were influencers. And so they aggregated tens of thousands of influencer channels and then would go to like, Coca-Cola and be like, hey, instead of trying to figure out which YouTube channels to advertise on individually, come to us, do one media buy, and we'll spread out your ads across a network of 10,000 channels. And then for the top 1% of creators in their network, they would help them create more premium content, maybe do film and TV deals, native brand deals. It was just a really challenging business model. It never quite worked out. I mean, Disney bought Maker Studios for, I think, the deal was up to $1 billion. It was a nice exit for Upfront and others, but I think looking back, it wasn't a great business for Disney. And so it was the kind of into this like looming, like, what do I do at Macro if I was the head of digital and there's not a digital business to build, that Adrian called us in 2016 and said, I'm leaving Andreessen. I'm looking to start a fund and I would be interested in doing this with you guys. And we had done some balance sheet investing at Macro, writing like $10,000 to $15,000 checks into synergistic companies like Blavity or Atom Tickets. We invested in an African digital company called OMG Digital. That was the BuzzFeed of Africa. And we enjoyed it. And I, had started my career as an investor, and Charles had been a very active angel investor, thanks to Pulp Rico and others. And so we decided to do this with Adrian and actually formalize our investing activity into a fund. And that's when M Ventures was born in 2017. And we did two small, we called them proof of concept funds because Adrian had come from Andreessen, but none of us were VCs. We had never done it. We were out there raising money, and LPs were like, great, we love your backgrounds. We love what you all have done in your prior careers, but you've never been a VC. Like, show us you can get deal flow. Show us you can win into competitive deals, that you can add value. And so we thought, well, let's just do that. Let's do that with two small funds. We found some very supportive LPs. And we were very active. We invested in 80 companies in 2.5 years over two funds. Wow. But it ingratiated us into the community. We learned a ton.
And so during this time, is Macro still running? Did you guys both leave? You and Charles? Is Charles still at Macro?
So Charles is still at Macro. Macro is still a very successful and growing business. We refer to Charles as he is a general partner of Mac. We call him a special GP, but I'd probably most VC firms, he would just be considered a venture partner because he spends the majority of his time running Mac. But he is a very strategic partner in a lot of ways. He's incredibly plugged into all areas of Hollywood. Denzel Washington was supposed to be here with me today, but he got caught up in traffic. But, he's on Charles's speed dial. Okay. But we have great access to celebrity talent, to executive talent, to, the agencies as I look out on CIA. We can help, and we do, as I'll talk about, a lot of investing in the kind of tech and media space. And a lot of companies need help navigating this landscape. Hollywood's a very closed community. If they don't know you, they're not calling you back. They can waste your time. They can take your money. And so we act as Sherpas to a lot of these companies that need to navigate this ecosystem. And few VCs, I think, are as well positioned as we are to do that.
That's a great description. Just for our listeners, can you clarify who are the full-time GPs at the fund?
Sure. The full-time GPs are Marlon Nichols, Adrian Fenty, and myself. And then in San Francisco, we have, there are partners, they're not general partners, Allison DiNardo, and here we have Danny Brown.
So with those as the sort of different partners, do you all have different areas you focus on? And particularly, what is your area? What are your areas you like to focus on?
For sure. So I'll go back to, we invest in what we know, and what we know, we feel like we know better than anyone else. I'll kind of move away from my areas because I'll dive in a little deeper in a second. But obviously with Adrian and his background in government and politics, we invest in kind of this area that we sort of call it smart cities, which isn't perfectly accurate, but it's sort of a broad term to describe any kind of company that touches upon the way people live, commute, work inside of a city. So that can be everything from a micromobility scooter company to a power infrastructure company. And obviously those types of companies need to understand how to navigate governments of all level and bureaucracy and red tape. And Adrian, there's not many mayors, maybe no mayors, that are doing early stage investing, he's very qualified to help them navigate those issues as he was doing at Andreessen. So we do a lot of that, and that's sort of his purview. I would say, Marlon does a lot of investing in the enterprise space, marketplaces, commerce, direct to consumer. He does a lot of consumer investing. He has a really interesting cultural thesis that's been guiding him, since cross-culture days, which is sort of looking for pop cultural trends that are driving people, industries, and investing in companies that are sort of either riding the wave or the ones causing that wave. So, he just did a post a couple of weeks ago about the changing nature of being a parent, especially, as it relates to moms and working moms and busy moms and all the implications that has and opportunities for startups to come in and take advantage of the fact that there are, so many working and busy moms out there and dads and the opportunities that creates. So pop culture to him just doesn't mean the number one song on the Billboard charts or the number one movie at the box office.
So that probably means if I'm an entrepreneur approaching Marlon, I want to lead with the trend, the wave that I'm riding.
Very much so. I've learned this, and Marlon, I'm sorry if you're listening to this, but I know how to get Marlon excited about a deal, which is frame it in a way that is, this is taking advantage of a cultural trend, or is the one developing the cultural trend, because that's a thesis and a filter that he looks at opportunities through. And then I would say, the area that I look at and Charles looks at the most, and I'll probably kind of call it, new media meets tech, but going even more specific. And I'd love to dive into some of these, but obviously video games are not a new concept, but video games, the future of video games as social networks, things like that are super interesting. This idea of new sports, and new sports can mean esports, but it can also mean new ways to think about or consume existing sports. So that's a really interesting area for me and for us. Interactive content. I think, what the cable television was to the 1980s, 1990s, I think interactive content will be to the 2020s and beyond. So interactive content, giving audience agency in what they're watching on screens, I think is super interesting. This area of virtual humans and synthetic reality, I think is incredibly interesting. I think my son at some point will follow or admire as many virtual people as he does actual human beings. So we think that's a really interesting area. And then creative market networks on in creative fields. Hollywood movies, albums have sort of been made, TV shows have been made kind of the same way since they were in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Obviously there's new technology, but it's a pretty inefficient process, and there's some really interesting companies trying to change the way creative people get together to make creative product, from a web series all the way up to a feature film. And I think that's a really interesting area for disruption. And so looking at companies in that space.
So I'm really curious about two of the areas that you mentioned, games and interactive content. Games are inherently interactive content.
Right.
And so what kind of different interactive content do you think of that's not a game, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? And I think, on one end of the spectrum, there's Candy Crush, or, maybe as you move a little bit towards the right, there's Fortnite or League of Legends, but, kind of considered FIFA, Madden, what you would kind of consider traditional either mobile games or console games or computer games. But then you get into this area that's, RIP, but Telltale Games, that was a really great company that was making kind of hybrid video games meets a movie, kind of playable video games that had narrative storylines, scripts, things like that. I mean, Red Dead Redemption is almost like a playable movie. I mean, there are definitely gaming storylines, but there are a lot, beautiful cutaway scenes. And then as you move even more to the right, there's stuff like an amazing company out of the UK called Pladio that made one of my favorite apps, one of my kids' favorite apps, called Avo, AVO. And it's the story, it's basically a playable web series, and it's the story of this young female scientist and her pet avocado sidekick. And she is kind of developing this cool technology, and she asks Avo to go gather and do various things. And when she's asking Avo, she's really asking you. And you control Avo through your mobile phone by kind of drawing lines on the screen, having Avo go walk various places, pick up things. You get rewards and points as you kind of achieve this. So you're sort of, you're playing this web series, and it's really well written and acted and shot. But it's a game, and there's in-app purchases, and you can dress Avo by buying certain outfits. And it's a really amazing melding of a web series and a mobile game. And it was just very elegantly done. And there's actually the creator did this 4-piece medium series where he said, film schools need to create a whole new curriculum on how we think about developing, writing, shooting, lighting, editing, interactive content, playable content, because you can't think of it in the same way that Martin Scorsese thinks about The Irishman. And he's right. Like, we're in the very early days and people are experimenting, but they need to sort of codify like these things and start teaching it if it's really going to blossom.
So do you think the innovation is going to come out of the game people and making more content like games, or do you think it's going to come out of the traditional movie and TV industry?
We're seeing, video games have become movies, and these game engines, are being used by filmmakers and studios to create whole scenes. So it's happening. But I think what sometimes tech people underestimate or overlook is just the importance of the creative and the narrative and the story. It's like, oh, well, if the tech's great, the story is just kind of secondary. And alternatively, I think, some of these platforms, Quibi, others, are like, well, if we get the great content, that's all that matters. But no, if you're not putting an emphasis behind the tech and the content discovery and taking advantage of the form factor, that you're watching the content through, you're totally missing out. And content, great content, is not enough for the future. And we talked about, streaming wars. I do think that the streaming wars will be in part won by those people that put a premium on the technology. Netflix was first and foremost a technology company. They have an office in Los Gatos. They put their engineers on a pedestal. The tech people historically at the agencies, studios, when I was at William Morris, the more tech-minded people sat in windowless offices in the basement. They were the nerds. It was the gut-driven instinct people that were exalted. And same way at the studios, the tech people were never exalted in the way they should have been. And I think it's starting to change.
But one challenge I find and I think a lot of traditional VCs are coming from the tech side of the world, not the media content side of the world. I struggle with evaluating content. Like, I agree with what you said, which is you can't have the content be an afterthought. But how do you evaluate whether the content is going to be great?
That's a challenge. And I sometimes get into trouble with this with my Hollywood peers. I am a more of a data-driven analytical person. At the agency, when I was reading scripts, client scripts, I was never quite comfortable giving my analysis because I think this is so subjective. Or when we had a quote like, an actor's price for a role, I'm like, well, how are you coming to this price? And it was sort of like, well, that's what he made from his last movie, and then he was on this magazine cover and has this many Instagram followers, so this is going to be his new price. And I'm just like, I don't get this. It's so subjective. I'm used to like DCF models and, Excel. And that's why I really admire Netflix. I think they've done such a brilliant job at using data to inform creative decisions, but to not dictate them, to not paint by numbers, but basically to stack the deck in their favor by telling you, this type of content or these themes are resonating or have a higher likelihood of success, or this actor, this director, this writer, or these combination of artists. But you still need someone to come in and write the screenplay, to direct the movie, to act brilliantly. But you may see some synthetic actors. You're already seeing AI written screenplays that are like horrendous. So maybe eventually, but I don't think anytime soon we're going to see the artistic fields replaced by AI or data. But yeah,
I didn't actually know what areas of data I would be mining. So it's interesting. Yeah, mining, of course, the certain age demographics, or the data of how actors have performed in the past. But I don't actually know the Netflix, how they use the data wisely.
I'm not exactly sure either. I do know that they are looking at tons and tons of data points, so much so that it will sort of dictate the size of budgets in certain genres or for certain projects. The data will be like, oh, like Adam Sandler movie has a high likelihood to drive user retention or new user signups. So, you can go and throw a couple $100 million at a few Adam Sandler movies when Hollywood might tell you, no way. Like, he's cold, he's washed up. Like, I remember when they did that deal with him originally, it was sort of like a head scratcher. Like, wow, they really just committed to that many Adam Sandler movies, and it's performed extraordinarily well. So, I think the black box nature of how they use data, slowly they're starting to trickle out how they're doing it. And honestly, like, just think about it. If we sat here for like 2 hours and wrote down every single thing that could affect the outcome of a movie, like, we come up with, maybe 1,000 different data points. That's a lot, but not insurmountable. And you start, how do we measure these? How do we weight these? I think there's an interesting way. And I'm actually like looking for companies. I'm going to write a blog post in the new year about the use of data in historically creative industries, whether it's, film and television or beauty and cosmetics or fashion. These are industries where, people like Anna Wintour or Karl Lagerfeld, these golden gut creative geniuses come in and say, this is what's going to be popular. And boom, it happens. And I think that will never go away. But how can we not use data in the world that we live in? It's the new oil. And there's a lot of room for amazing companies to be built in that space.
Yeah, I had a chance to work with a famous author a few years ago, and this author has had lots of movies made by different studios. And I sat in on one of his marketing calls, and I was dumbfounded by how little data they had, and the fact that he couldn't have data from movies made by other studios. And it was mind-boggling. So it seems like at least at that point, there was a long way to go.
And exciting because what you can do with just a little bit of effort can give you such an advantage. I think it's part of the impetus that, every major, Hollywood studio, television network are going direct to consumer. They realize the importance of having that direct to consumer access to data to inform a lot of things in their business.
And direct to consumer as opposed to, or what are the implications of that? Who's falling out of the value chain?
Yeah, well, it's one of the things we've noticed is, Hollywood entertainment business has sort of moved from this wholesale model to a retail model where, Disney historically, they had a studio that made shows. They sold those shows to, let's say, FX, and FX would air the show. But even FX didn't sell direct. FX was distributed by Comcast or by Time Warner, by these, multi-video program distributors. And so no one was going direct really except your cable company who you pay directly and they had that relationship with you. So Disney wasn't selling direct, FX wasn't selling direct. And now, in the same way when Disney releases a movie through the theaters, it's put out through AMC or, you name the exhibitor, they necessarily don't know who's coming to their movies. They don't know how they felt. They don't know, there's no information. It's given to the exhibitors. And the exhibitors, frankly, they're not tech companies. They're not really using it. So it's just such a missed opportunity. So now everyone's going direct. So it's like, we're Disney. We're going to make, Frozen 2, although it's probably a bad example because it came out through the theater, but we'll make Frozen 3. And maybe we'll put it out theatrically, but maybe now we'll own the theater chain because they're talking about getting rid of that decree where studios couldn't own them. So maybe Disney or Netflix owns theater chains so they can have that first party relationship, or we'll put it out on Disney Plus and we'll know exactly who's watching it, for how long, where they took off, where they came back in, what they watched after. And that will inform the types of content they make. It will inform the parks, merchandising, tours, cruise ships.
No, I was just going to ask about, so streaming is a huge part of that, right? That is going direct and having people be able to owning those channels, right?
Right, yeah.
So what's going on like in the streaming wars?
I think LionTree, the investment bank, said they counted like 120 different over-the-top streaming services that were both subscription and ad-supported, which is insane. What's amazing to me is that no one really talks about technology. There's a couple interesting things that I've seen about Quibi, where it suggests that they are putting some thought behind the tech side of it and not just the content. And maybe these are sort of gimmicky right now. Maybe there's more up their sleeve. But, the one is the Steven Spielberg show that you can only watch at night. So it will only be locked when sunset. sunsets in the city where you're watching the show, which is kind of cool. The phone's got a camera. You can interact with things. So interactive content, it's a perfect medium to kind of explore this interactive content medium. But no one's doing that. They're still serving up the passive lean back, 20-minute, 30-minute experience.
I'm really interested in the different models of interactive content. So I was just talking with a friend about betting, which is a form of interacting, right? Like if I'm watching a live...
For sure.
So what are the when you think about interactive content beyond just, holding a phone a different way or choose your own adventure sort of stuff, what do you think about that's interesting and interactive?
So I won't say the company name because they haven't really announced yet, but they're working on a new format of interactive content that we saw as fairly mind-blowing. But it essentially, you've seen like the deep fake videos and things like that. So they can essentially take, images of an actor or a couple frames or, maybe 100 photos if it's meant to be more realistic. And they can essentially have an actor say or do anything. Instead of having to shoot, with Bandersnatch, they had to shoot every single branching narrative, which can get expensive and time consuming. That's not scalable. So the choose your own adventure branching narrative is interesting. It's great experimentation, but it's not scalable. So I hate to say deepfake because it has a negative connotation. I think there's a very good side to this kind of, AI-driven technology, but it will allow a studio or a producer or creative to essentially, take an actor or actors or scene and have it say or do anything based upon your input. But it's funny. I always use the example of my son, picking up magazines and trying to swipe everything.
Yeah.
Because the expectation that everything's interactive, everything's participatory. His expectation is that he has agency in everything that he sort of picks up, his media options. So I think as he gets older, this idea of interacting with my content, it'll sort of be a desirable thing. I mean, sure, he'll want to disconnect and passively watch content, but I think he'll find the idea of affecting the outcome of content through his own engagement participation to be interesting and almost like a requirement in some cases. And so I think it's stuff like that people are working on that's really interesting.
Gosh, there's so much here to talk about. I think we could go on for several hours, but I do want to ask about community. And, to me, some of these interactive ideas seem very isolating.
It's interesting. People have said Fortnite is the new social network. And it's true. I mean, some people log on just to talk with each other, playing the game is almost a secondary thing. And I think that's absolutely true. I don't think here we have TikTok as kind of like the new social platform of the moment, but I think the next Facebook level social media platform, Instagram level, will be built either through a video game or, in the metaverse through a virtual environment. And that could be 10 years away. I don't think it's that far away, but I really believe that will be the case.
And when these companies come to you, whether it's interactive media or else, do you have certain things that you're looking for?
Yeah, it's hard sometimes depending on kind of the specific area of new media. Obviously, we invest in SaaS companies, we invest in marketplaces and DTC companies, and you've had Brian Lee on, and he talked really well about what he looks for, and we look for those things as well. But if you're coming with an interactive content company, or we invested in Brud, which is the company behind Little Michaela, and we invested pretty early. And yeah, I guess we did. We looked at kind of their social media engagement of her and the other characters. But for us, it was these types of investments. We do come in early. It's more about the founder and their vision. And sometimes how crazy is that vision? And does it sort of align to the way, we see the future playing out? Or is it, in the case of Brud, it was so out there where he's like, listen, there's hundreds of millions of people that follow the Kardashian and Jenner clans. They've never met them. Maybe they are virtual. Do we know that Kim Kardashian's a real human being? My only interaction has been through social media, television. So he's like, why can't I create a virtual person, follow the same algorithm of celebrity that the Kardashians and Jenners have followed, and build someone up? And that's sort of what he did. And we're like, yeah, why not? You don't have to be human anymore to be a celebrity, to be an influencer. I mean, Japan's always been ahead of us, but Hatsune Miku, who's a huge pop star over there, sold out the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York, back-to-back nights. She got married. A human being married her earlier this year. She is of Justin Bieber level fame in Japan, and she's not real. So I don't think people have to be human. Look out, humans, because the robots are coming. It's more on team more often in this space, in this kind of new media interactive content space.
Great.
Yeah.
Where can these amazing teams find you? How can they reach you?
Mike at macventurecapital.com, our website, and Palank 101 on Twitter. We're everywhere. We're in Hollywood. We're everywhere. Come find us, please. I love talking about this and meeting companies in this space. It's super exciting.
You're really knowledgeable about it. Thanks for sharing. This is great.
That's great. And just for the record, Mike is real.
Hey, everyone. Hope you're having a good day. It's Saturday for me right now, and I just got back from the pool with my 3 kids. And I got a message from a listener, Joe, who reached out on LinkedIn and shared an amazing spreadsheet with me that has all of our LA Venture Podcast guests, their size check, their sector focus, links to their LinkedIn. It's a great resource. I'm putting it in the show notes. I hope you guys find it useful, and give us 5 stars on iTunes or wherever you listen to this show. Don't bother leave a review. I realize that's asking too much. Anyhow, thanks for listening.